gives you two colors. So you can save your money on dyes that way. So here we have a regular pattern again and the stencil. So you put it on the fabric and then the laughing dries and creates a resist, and then dip it into a cold dye and the pattern comes out. Over here we have a very simple pattern. It's very similar to the other one I showed you earlier, where you pick the fabric. In this case it was twisted and then it was tied. So the areas that are white are the areas that were tied firmly so that the dye doesn't get to those areas. And so we have a pattern like so. By the time you measure it, it gives you this design. And then they have other patterns here which are also tied up with rope. This is the last pattern, and it's very simple. It's a red fabric that was dyed in brown. So if you look at the lines running through, they were achieved by pleating the cloth, just pleating like a corrugated iron sheet. You keep pleating it back and front, and then it is now tied and then dyed in brown dye. So you can see that tie and dye is a very simple and interesting art. And as usual, we're going to show you the tools used for the trade. We also will show you the materials, and then we'll go into the processes.
This is the foam used for creating very set patterns for the batik method. And then we have the spoon for measuring out the other chemicals. We also have the pair of scissors for cutting the fabric and other softer materials, and you have the needles for sewing. We have the beeswax or the paraffin wax, which is the white one, are used for the batik method. The beeswax is really very good because it creates very sharp resist. And then we have the dyes of various colors, and these are called vat dyes and they're permanent dyes. The colors are usually fast. When I say fast, it means that the colors don't wash off, and then have them in a variety of colors. And this is the cassava starch, which has been made into a thick consistency. Then we have the binding material, threads, wool for tying the fabric, and twine. You can also use twine, and you can also use thread. And then the stencil, which is used for creating patterns using the Adire Eleko method. That's the hydrosulfide. It is usually very smooth and smells like rotten egg. We also have the tailor's chalk for marking out patterns on the fabric. And then we need plenty of water in buckets and bowls. We also need a source of heat for melting, which could be a stove. And we need a bowl and an aluminium bowl for melting the wax. So now we'll begin work. But before that, I would like to introduce the various techniques we'll be learning today. The Adire Eleko method, or the cassava starch resist method. We'll also be learning the batik method, using set patterns like the foam we saw earlier on, or just drawing freehand designs using wax. And then we have the alabe or stitch and dye technique. And then we have the knotting technique, which is the tie and dye technique, where we tie cloth into knots. We also have the pleating method, and we have the round pattern method. So we're going to start with the Adire Eleko or cassava starch resist pattern. But before we put on the patterns on the fabric, we have to lay the table with paper. And sometimes you can also use nylon, a sheet of nylon, and pad the table so well so that when you apply the wax, it just mops it all off. So you strike the fabric over the table. But it's very important that you wash the material before it is dyed, because from the manufacturers there's some little chalk or starch on the surface which you might not see. So when you wash off the starch, then it can absorb a lot of dye. So we stretch it all out, and you can use thumbtacks to pin it down to hold it onto the table. That is the stencil we saw earlier on, which was cut from linoleum. You can also cut out organic shapes or geometric shapes or whatever you design. And I find that the linoleum is a very tough material because you could use it for several prints. It's ordinary carpet you use for living room. So you cut out your design with a sharp blade and you now pass the laughing or cassava starch through the grooves which you have cut out, making sure that it doesn't go past the size of the stencil. So you now take it all up, pick it up, and then try to align it again until you've covered the whole surface of the fabric with the pattern. Now the laughing is mixed with a bit of alum to make it very sticky, and it really helps in the binding of it and also keeps it firm before it is dyed. So here we have the pattern transferred on most parts of the fabric. So you just keep on laying. Once you stretch out the pattern, then you take it on again until you cover the whole surface. So she's using something like a spatula, which is a very thick tile. You can use a flat plastic foam to transfer the laughing through the grooves onto the fabric. So when the whole surface is covered up, you need to spread it all out and support it at all four corners so that it doesn't get blown over by wind. So you keep that until it dries completely. The next method is the batik method of doing designs on fabrics, and here you use wax. So what she's doing here is she's trying to dip in the foam into the wax to create very regular patterns. So you can actually cut foam into any design that you desire. And for the wax method, you have to be sure that the wax is not too hot or too cold. If it is too hot, then it just bleeds on the material and spreads so rapidly, so that when you dye it, the dye actually penetrates through where the wax is. But when the wax is the right temperature, it's not smoking on the fire, then it really becomes very good when you dye it in any color of dye. So here, like I said earlier on, we have the papers at the bottom of the fabric, and I would mop up the wax as you put it on the cloth. So again, she dips the foam into the wax, and sometimes we have some paper to blot out the excess wax, and then begin to stamp out the patterns on the fabric. So this is a very regular pattern, but the way and manner in which you distribute the set design also brings some interesting patterns onto your fabric. So you could do that by varying the way in which you lay the patterns. It could be in a checkered pattern, as you leave a gap and then put another one, just keep spacing it out that way. Or you can cluster these patterns together, like what she's doing here. Remember that the cloth has to be stretched out. Sometimes you might even iron the fabric before putting on the wax patterns, but the wax must be the right temperature. It must not be smoking on the fire. It must not be very cold. Once you have the right temperature of wax, you see that the newspaper at the bottom will begin to show through the cloth. So now we're trying to create some patterns on the fabric. We want to distribute the set designs in a very planned manner. So we are trying to create designs. This is freehand. You relax when you're doing batik. You're not uptight. You just create your patterns. And now we're using foam again to do freehand designs to outline the patterns which you have done earlier on. So we're going to make this into a bubu. So all around the triangle, the square in the middle, we'll cut out the neckline. So you can see what I said earlier on, the way the patterns are distributed on the surface of the fabric. So it doesn't have to be all clustered together. Some can be clustered and others can be very separate. So you use a tailor's chalk on the fabric because that will easily wash off when it gets into water or dye. You can also use a pencil. Now we have paraffin wax for this batik method, but you can also use beeswax. The difference between beeswax and paraffin wax is that the beeswax will give you a full resist, and the paraffin wax will not give you as sharp a resist as what the beeswax will give you. Now, this is another design, and this is what is known as a stitch and dye or Alabere method. So here we're going to use big needles, sometimes even small needles, and then we pass thread through the eye of the needle, and then we stitch out the designs which we created on the surface of the cloth. So you can fold it in 2, you can also fold it in 4, or even in 6 parts, and then you can use the sewing machine over it, and that will also give you a different design. But here we're using the hand to sew, using a big needle to sew patterns or big tacking stitches on the fabric. So we follow the designs on the cloth. Again, this is the batik method, and this is a freehand technique. So we'll come back again to the stitch and dye method, where we make the big stacking stitches. Sometimes you can double the thread, or even make it 2 on one side of the needle or 4 on one side of the needle, so depending on what kind of design you want. But always make sure that when you pull the thread after it has been, you finish sewing, then you make sure it is very, very tight. It actually gives very exciting designs. The Alabere or stitch and dye technique is a very popular way of creating tie and dye designs from fabric. Sometimes you can also dye your fabric before you begin to create designs on it. Here is the freehand design. Like I said earlier on, we had the newspapers on, but you can also use a nylon sheet, which is easier to take off when you finish your waxing. So this fabric was dyed in orange, and so when we put a second color, we now have 2 colors on the fabric. The earlier ones were done in white fabric. We didn't do any designing on this. Sometimes you can even just do some very light pattern before creating your designs, either using wax or cassava starch, or doing the needle thread. This method is known as the knotting technique. You could fold the cloth in 2. You can leave it as one sheet, but you just look for the corners and tie knots, and you tie very firmly. Very simple. Tie and dye is such an exciting art because it really gives you a lot of freedom to explore. The interesting thing here is that anything you tie will come out as a beautiful pattern. So you really don't need to be a wonderful artist to do this art. So anything you tie, as long as you tie it very firmly, will come out beautifully when put into dye. So here she's tied a big knot, and then she's going to take the edges of the fabric and she'll keep on tying knots until the cloth is really very small. So that's another corner. So she ties it again into a very firm knot. Again, the cloth has been dyed in orange dye. So the first color will be orange, and the next color will be the color that you dip the fabric into. So what it means is that all those areas that are knotted are going to remain as orange. The inner part will remain as orange, while the outer part will take the color that the fabric has been put in. measure out the size of the pleats. But here we're just doing something that is irregular, which will also bring out a beautiful pattern. So the cloth has been folded in two first of all, and then we're pleating from the edge. You can also pleat from the side of the fabric. The pleated pattern will give you lines on the fabric when it is dyed. So we can bind it by folding over into two, or folding it or leaving it straight. Now you can fold it into two this way and tie, and that will give you an arced pattern instead of a straight line, but to give you something with a sharp angle. Or you can just tie it on straight. So she's going to bind the pattern. So tie and dye means literally that you tie the cloth and then you dye it. So that's what we're doing. We're tying now, and then later we dye the fabric and the designs come out. What it also means is that you don't have to be a wonderful artist to do this kind of art. There's no hard and fast rule about the art of tie and dye. So if you can tie firmly, then you can do tie and dye. And you really don't have to have very set patterns in mind. You can be free in creating